So lighting is a very important aspect of Blender as it will add a whole aesthetic to your scene. So in this video, I'll be showing you the basics of adding in different types of lights and using the world settings to your advantage. So the first thing we're going to do is enable material preview just to get a sense of how our scene should look under a neutral lighting set. So I can press the Z key and click on material preview. And this is material preview mode. In material preview mode, there's no lighting taken into account. So there's no highlights or shadows. So if I press Shift A and add in an area light, you can see that it has no effect on the scene. There's no bright spots or anything like that. So I can delete it like so. So this is just to have a good sense of how your materials look under neutral lighting. It does take into account a few things such as roughness, metallic, and bump, and quite a lot of things. However, it just doesn't consider light bounces or any other type of post-rendering effects such as bloom. So what we can do is go into rendered mode by pressing the Z key and clicking on rendered. And as you can see, we can't see anything. And that is because we have no lighting in the scene. So what we can do is turn up the strength of our world settings. And by default, this is typically 1. So I can turn it up like so. And as you can see, there's not much difference compared to the material preview mode because all of the world is emitting light. There's no opportunity for there to be shadows or anything else. So if I crank up the strength, it looks almost exactly like material preview mode. So I can just turn it down back to 1, and then I can change the color as well. So if I change the color to white, it has a similar effect of turning up the strength. However, you can also change the color of your entire world by playing around with your color wheel. If I play around with the color wheel, it's the world settings will change in correspondence to it. However, I don't recommend you light your scene, especially not with an ultra saturated color, or else your entire scene won't look too good. So if you're ever going to change the color of your scene, make sure it's very subtle. Anyway, I will just darken the scene by bringing this down to a gray color. And then what we can add in is the first type of lighting, the one that I use the most and many other Blender users use quite often, and it is the area light. So if I press Shift A and add in an area light, as you can see, it's already illuminating our desk. And if I just press G and Z to drag it up, you can see that this spot is no longer shining so intensely because, even in real life, when you bring a light closely to something, the light will reflect quite harshly off of that surface. So if we go over to the right hand side here, we have a few settings which we will discuss. So color is pretty self-explanatory. We can change the color of our light, and this can bring in some different aesthetics to the scene. So if I pick like an orange or red color, that gives a more warm atmosphere to our scene. And then what I can do is bring up the power. The power is essentially just the intensity of our light. So if I want, I can just drag that up. And as you can see, that increases the strength of our lights. And then I've just turned down the world settings just to further accentuate this effect. So if I just click on my light and go back into settings, that's what happens when we use power. So if I just go into front view and just bring it to the top here, you can see that a power of only 130 will greatly illuminate the scene. And then we have the diffuse factor. Diffuse, I like to think of it as how much the light spreads. So if I bring down the light, you can see that the light is no longer really spreading out too much. And that means I'll have to bring it closer to whatever I'm trying to light. So that's what I use for diffuse. Next we have specular. Specular is more for when we have shiny objects, how much light will reflect off of those objects, but it's not something that I touch too often. And then we have volume. This is to deal with volumetrics and how light can penetrate our volumetric objects, such as fog or clouds. And those are just the main features that we can play around with. But also we have the shape. So we have square, which is set to default, rectangle, which is pretty much the same as square. I don't see any need to ever switch from square to rectangle, as if you have square, you can just press S and X, and then you have a rectangle, or S and Y, and you have a rectangle. So to me, it doesn't really make sense to choose rectangle. And then you also have disk, which gives you a perfect sphere. So if I just go into solid mode, we have a perfect circle, excuse me. And then if we go to ellipse, then we can, it's pretty much the same deal as with the square and the rectangle situation, where you can just have a elongated circle. So yeah, so typically I only stick to square or disk, and just then press S to scale if necessary. All right, so that's it for the area lights. That's the most commonly used light for me, at least. The next light that we have is point light. So point light is like just a ball of light essentially. And again, we have all of the similar properties as seen in the area lights. So we have color, power, diffuse, specular, volume, and radius, which is pretty much equivalent to size in our area lights. So we have this ball of light here, but if we scale it out, as you can see, our light is being spread out over a larger area. Therefore, the intensity per I guess square or meter squared is decreased. So area light, or point light, I don't use it too much unless I have like one bit of lighting in my scene, as it's more of like an omnidirectional piece of lighting, where similar to the world light, it kind of illuminates everything around it. So you rarely ever need multiple point lights. However, having multiple area lights, in my experience, is a lot more useful. So the next light is the sunlight, and that is very similar to our world lighting. The strength is way too high for sunlight, so we can turn it to 1, something much more muted, or even 5. One thing about the sunlight is that in your renders, although in Eevee viewport mode, you might see a few different effects. The position of your sunlight actually shouldn't affect your render. So yeah, the sunlight isn't one that I use too much. However, the most notable feature is the angle. So if we change the angle of our sunlight, we get more or less illumination. And this is probably the most useful feature of our sunlight. So as you can see, an angle of 180 does actually change our the lighting of our scene. So if you have a sunlight, instead of playing around with the position, it's actually better to play around with the angle. And the final light that we'll be discussing is the spotlight. So if I go into right view, what I can do is just scale down this thing massively. So with our area lights, what we can do is just move it over like so by pressing G, Shift, Z. And we can't see anything because we need to increase the power. So I'll increase it to something like 30. And yep, that's good. And the features that we're going to play with is the size. So as you can see, as I drag in the size, we have a more, we have a smaller area for our spotlights. So pressing S to scale doesn't actually work when it comes to our spotlight. It's playing with the size. And also if we play with the size like so, we can actually illuminate the entire scene. However, the spotlight is best used when we're trying to have a isolated piece or an isolated circle of light. We also have radius, which is, I guess, again, how much our lights can reach. Oops, so if I decrease the radius, we'll have a more concentrated light. However, if I increase it, then as you can see, the I increased it quite big here, but as you can see, our room has, or our lights can no longer be seen, as the little bit of light has been spread out throughout the entire scene. All right, so that's it for lighting in Blender. Just to show you how I would light the scene, I would do something very simple by adding in an area light, going into right view, pressing G and bringing it up like so. Move over here and then press S and X to scale on the X-axis and then scale on the Y-axis like so. And then what I'll do is I'll make it quite well lit, maybe 40 I think is good. And then I'll press G and Y to move it over to the middle, and then press Shift D, Y to move it over like so. Oh, one bonus piece of lighting that we can do is actually using a material. So what I can do is tab into edit mode, press face select and select this face here. We'll go to our materials property panel, and as you can see, there's already a monitor screen material in Blender, and we can just click assign, and that is another way of adding emission to our scene. We can also turn up the strength. However, that is best used when we are enabling bloom to our scene. So if I enable bloom, then go back to our material properties and change our strength to something like 20. As you can see, our screen is glowing. And then if I hide our shaders, you can see that our room is slightly being illuminated by the computer monitor. So if we want a bit of a spooky look to our scene, we can have the screen of our monitor illuminated a little bit. Maybe if we just turn like so. That's an interesting way of lighting the scene. But anyway, that's it for the basics of lighting in Blender. We'll be sure to revisit some lighting parts that you saw in this tutorial in later sections. But hopefully you have the gist of adding in lights in Blender.